Good morning, everyone. My name is Lakey Campbell, and I have the pleasure of introducing Thomas Lund, lead researcher at Genelec. He contributes to international audio standardization and has also authored several papers on human perception, spatialization, loudness, sound exposure, and true peak level. He'll actually be presenting two of those papers today. And the first one, he will be covering the impact of sound exposure and loudness-to-dialog-ratio on auditory envelopment. Please welcome Thomas Lund.
Won't me do this. Good morning, everybody, and I'm pleased to be here and be able to talk about audio here at SEMSE. I'm actually, as Lakey said, I'm talking about two of the main topics that I've been researching most of my life. But I'll start with the one here on sound exposure. And it actually relates a little bit to the loudness to dialogue metric I'll talk about also. But so let's get started. Generally, we as humans rely on a smart body, and we think that it protects us against most things, and it generally does, but not really when it comes to hearing. If we have a skin burn, or if we have something that causes pain in other ways, we have typically also reflexes that corrects the situation quickly. But that's unfortunately not the case with hearing. So when it comes to hearing, our body is not so smart, especially not when we're adult. So we don't get any warning when we are overdosing. On the contrary, many studies have found, for instance, music to be a stimuli that is euphoria-inducing, such as food, sex, and drugs of abuse. And but it has also been, music has been a human activity over thousands of years. So, of course, it is stimulating, and there are reasons for that I'll also come back to in my next talk here. But let's start a different place, because all our senses over the last at least 20 years, it's been found that we are active sensors. So we think of ourselves as experiencing the world as adults, but we're really not. We're reaching out for what we expect, and then we're getting a little bit in return. And the first to really discover this was Yarbus in the 60s, doing it with vision and using what is called saccadic eye movements, how we move our eyes to seek information. But what is less known is that the ear does exactly the same. Of course, we can see head and body movements, but the ears do much more than just that. So if we have static pressure across the tympanic membrane, so we can then pick up audio signals in the audible frequency range, and we can send nerve impulses to the brain. But the brain actually sends roughly as many nerve impulses back to the inner ear as goes up to the brain. So that's called the efferent pathways. So the afferent goes to the brain and the efferent goes the opposite direction. And even though we can't see it, those efferent pathways do exactly the same that they do for vision when we move our eyes around. So in natural hearing, we are constantly adjusting our ears, the ear, and we can do this very frequency selectively. It's very clever mechanism. So we're using special parts called the outer hair cells, mainly in the cochlea, to have this feature. So the brain reaches out in adults. This means that we have, as these numbers indicate, the brain can attenuate the level by around 20 dB in the middle ear by the small muscles for a little while in the middle ear, but it can also boost selectively any frequency it wants in the ear it wants, up to 60 dB. And if you think about that also from a frequency response perspective, that's a huge adjustment ability the brain has. So let's now talk a little bit about what can damage the ears, because it's not just a question of sound power. We all know the SPL metric, and SPL is a measure of sound power locally in the room where you happen to be. But and it relates, it's relative to 0 dB SPL is the threshold of hearing for a normally hearing person at 1 kilohertz. So, but sound power is not all we want to be aware of. We really want to be aware of sound energy, so which means power times time. And that means that we should, if we draw a diagram like this, where we have, you can see we have log scales on both axes, we can get the gold standard for in medicine right now is this diagram here, where you can see that we have for 80 dB SPL over 8 hours, that just hits the light gray area, which means threatening, or just threatening, just on the verge of safe. And then the equal energy principle applies. So if we go up 3 dB in average level, we have to halve the amount of time, and 6 dB up like here, we have to go a quarter of the time, and so forth. So that's the gold standard by going by current medical data. So how does that reflect in our global standards? Because of course we are all human. It doesn't matter probably if you're Japanese or Chinese or Danish or American. We likely have the same, you could say, toughness and also variability of toughness in ears. But these are the two standards that are, again, gold standard here. And they, the European Union and WHO, they just say adults should stick with this green energy. Then we have some occupational standards in Europe and US, and they're a little bit higher because we should allow workers then to use some protection. But all these three standards, you could say, are reasonable for different perspectives, but this one really isn't. The US OSHA isn't reasonable, not only because its baseline is extremely high, it accepts a lot of hearing loss, but also because it doesn't conform to the equal energy principle. So you see the three first I talked about, they all conform to the equal energy principle, but US OSHA goes crazy at shorter time intervals where it allows a lot of energy for the workers. And it means that if you go by statistics and by medical standards, these are the number of persons that are subjected to these four different standards that you can expect will develop hearing loss. So quite a quarter of the users in going by the OSHA standard will develop hearing loss if they are right on that 90 target, or right. Of course, it's much higher if you go higher, but just on the target will be a quarter of the listeners. Now, the next thing is that if we could just agree that we have global ears and we need a global standard, that would be very, very helpful, because these numbers that I'm talking about now, which is, it's not dB SPL, it's dB SEL, sound exposure level, and they are very, very difficult to calculate for a normal user. It's very difficult for you to say, I've been in 83 dB for 2 hours, 83 dB SPL for 2 hours, and then I was at 87 dB for 1.5 hours, and I was at 92 dB for 15 minutes. How does that relate to my daily dose? And if we just could agree that we use the same metric, that we are using the same baseline, then we can use percentage instead. So, you know, if you've been for 80 dB for 4 hours or something like that, that's half of your dose, or 50% of your dose. So this makes it much easier for users to work with and to understand when they're going between work and recreation and to a rock concert or in the cinema, what they should observe. So now we have the issue that, or let me just relate these numbers to the calibrated listening level that we're using in Pro Audio today. So let's say if we're working at 80 dB SPL as the average level. That's a reasonable level, because as you can see here on the graph, it means that if you have a flat frequency response in your system, you are just on the verge of the hearing threshold at very low frequency. So if you go much lower than 80 dB SPL, you really cannot hear the low frequencies anymore unless you boost them in your system. So if we think that flat frequency response is what we should use, then we should also not use lower than 80 dB SPL. But that leaves us right on, there's not much margin for error here. That's one thing we should realize. The A85, for instance, goes through a number of recommended listening levels depending on your room size. And that's very reasonable as well. I won't argue with that, but and the principle of having calibrated listening level is certainly relevant as well. If you see this slide here, you can see the difference in sensitivity. If we're listening at 40 dB SPL between 100 Hertz and 1 kilohertz, is 25 dB. But if we are listening at 80 dB SPL, which is to your right now, then that same difference is now only 12 dB. So you'll make a completely different mix at that level than you did at 40. And if you go up higher still, then again, it would be spectrally different. So calibrated level is certainly something we should be using. But again, pro audio is risky business. These are now like daily, you could say, exposures that we can get, including, for instance, as a musicians can generally often be even worse off than pro audio people. But you can see we're certainly in the you could say in the categories that are vulnerable here. But then we should also consider children, because unfortunately it gets worse from what I said. Those 80 dB, which is over 8 hours, which is already quite conservative to what most of us were used to. When I was starting in pro audio, I would be advised that 87 or 89 or something like that would be completely fine every day. But all medical data tells the opposite now. And unfortunately, it tells even more so for kids. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture here, this is because in Denmark we have like a music contest, and I'm sure you have the same here. It's for kids between 8 and 15 years. So, and then when and it's on national television, and then they go out and do shows afterwards. And I went there with a couple of my grandchildren, and they are of course often younger than this. So the audience can typically be from 4 years up rather, or something like that. And here comes the problem that WHO and medical data suggest that kids are roughly 5 dB more sensitive than we are. So it means that those two gray areas now have been lowered by 5 dB, and we should consider that when we bring kids to concerts or in cinema or sports events. So it's the 75 dB that's relevant here. And at that concert event I talked about before with the young performers, the level in the hall, I measured it just with my iPhone in the hall, which I have calibrated, so it's not far off. It was around 91.2, I think, dB sound exposure level over 2 hours. So, and if you look at the 2 hour mark here, you can see it's clearly into that gray area. And unfortunately now when we're here at Temte, I need to mention another anecdote as well. I went to see Puss in Boots with my granddaughter in a fine digital cinema in my hometown Aarhus, where after the first 10 minutes, every child in the hall were covering their ears, and I had brought out my phone again. I thought it was pretty loud as well, and it clocked over those first 10 minutes at around 89.5, which is, so that's the crosshair here I put, and I went out to find an operator And he reluctantly came in and said, no, it is like it should be. And he could just see everybody was covering their ears. And reluctantly, he lowered the level, at least so it was tolerable for most of the audience. But the issue here is that he couldn't really lower it enough because speech intelligibility got lost, because everybody wanted to go maybe 6 or 8 dB down further. But then we couldn't understand the words anymore. So that was the dilemma here. And that brings me to the next topic of this paper, the loudness-to-dialogue ratio. And even though it wasn't intended for kids' movies in cinemas, there might be this application for it that I just want you as professionals to consider. Because this was made by the European Broadcasting Union. As you may know, they are not using very much the dialogue measure as the anchor of broadcast programming. And that means that there are relatively good levels in Europe in commercials, between commercials and programs, but feature films and wide loudness range material like excellent, let's say, Netflix or HBO productions, they can have a problem with dialogue falling too low, or you have to turn up the level. And so this was a recommendation based on that, investigating when does it become a problem generally in broadcast, when can you not use the general loudness anchor anymore. And the answer was that this LDR measurement, and I'll just briefly explain it to you. You might know that in the BS 1770 standard, we have the true peak measure and the loudness measure. So they are given already, and they're shown here, the ends of the blue bars here. But a little down into the green bar, you can see a little, you could say, out of zoom area, and the reason or why it's a little bit blurred, the dialogue area, because it's not, as you could say, set in stone as the two others. It depends on classification of dialogue. So, but you can still measure it, and Dolby have had good meters to do this for many years, or at least one way of measuring dialogue objectively. But again, we have this blurred zone here. And we can see the examples 2 and 3. They are film examples where there's a big difference between the dialogue and the average loudness, and that's a problem in broadcast. And it was also the problem with Puss in Boots I talked about before. So let me just summarize a bit of this. The loudness-to-dialogue ratio below -5 LU, that's the difference between the loudness and dialogue level, is found to make programs more robust. So you can reproduce them at different sound levels without risking too much that speech intelligibility gets lost. We have tried it, or just experimentally tried it on kids' movies, and it would actually make sense. It would have helped, in this case, the Danish dubbed version of Puss in Boots, if they had at least fulfilled that criterion. Also, of course, as engineers, we have to understand that what we like might not be the same as the audience likes. So if we think that this is the level it needs to be reproduced at, some audience might actually want, and especially kids, want it to be 5 or 6 or 10 dB softer. I know Charles from Dolby will have a paper here about some of these issues today also, and I think you should keep this in mind as well if you listen to that paper. So with my experience, I think that loudness-to-dialogue ratio in dubbing for kids should be recommended as well. So if you're a big, in Europe, many of the kids programs, you just have to understand, they are dubbed so in cinema, so the kids don't see the English version. So even though the English version might be fine, the dubbed version can be way off. For the youngest age groups, because the dub movies, of course, are typically for the kids below 10, then it might be even better with less than 5 LU between loudness and dialogue. But we haven't confirmed that, but it's just my hunch. Loudness-to-dialog-ratio is displayed, or it can be deduced already now in different meters, for instance from RTW or from Dolby. So it's just following the normal standards. There's nothing magic about it. It's a good measure, I think, to start observing. So let me conclude this, that if there is a safe sound exposure level generally, then it's certainly lower than previously thought and very much lower than stipulated by OSHA. Millions of Americans and Europeans will develop hearing loss because of these old standards. We can help our kids in future generations, and they're even more constantly online. It's great to see companies stepping up to their obligations. For instance, like Apple. Apple have been following this work quite closely, so they're one of the good guys in this respect, I would say, because you simply have an obligation when you're sticking transducers into kids' ears, and you also have an obligation when you're making cinema movies for kids. A hearing aid is not a real patch for lost, when I call it efferent pathways. If you remember back, that's the pathways from the brain to the ear. So while the hearing aid can boost certain frequencies and help you with regaining some understanding, it doesn't regain the complete what is called functional hearing, because functional hearing is hearing when you are in a noisy environment, and that's where the brain really does all its tricks to adjust the ears constantly. And unfortunately, our hearing aids are not capable of doing that. So it's better to protect our hearing while we have it. Then I'd say that we should all disregard OSHA, forget it completely, but instead listen to our kids when they say it's too loud. It might be that kids have a better connection between what is harmful, and they have not learned how much joy there is in sound yet, so we are maybe sort of suppressing it, stomaching it, so to speak, but kids are not yet, so we should probably listen to them rather than the other way around. Then this one global standard, I would really advocate for that, because it would make standardization much easier and communication. There's the brilliant US initiative called Safe Listening, where if kids learn this from an early age, that they can just add these numbers together and then they know if they're safe or unsafe regardless of their activities, then it would be a great big help in making them understand the limits at an early age. And finally, this loudness-to-dialog-ratio could be applied when mixing children's movies to make sure that dialogue is always understood, even if the playback level is lowered. These are some of the references, but I've written a paper. I think everybody has written a paper here for this conference, so there are many more details there. For now, I'll just, if you have any comments or questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Hello, Darren May from CUNY TV. Just very curious about the research. It's fascinating. Do you have any data regarding the dialogue adjustments between languages? As some languages have more hard consonants and ejectives, that the phonemes are much easier to understand at a low level versus something like Danish, which has very soft vowels and a lot of soft consonants and a lot of vowels, which is more delicate, which requires more boost. So is there a coefficient by language that you found in your studies?
That's a great question. I think this has only been applied in Europe. So the European languages are relatively similar, not completely similar. So across Europe, and so the European languages have been used, of course, including English. But I agree with you. You can easily find languages that have much more consonants, for instance, or other types of sounds, and it might not hold the same. So I'm not saying and I think, and also the European Broadcasting Union, I'm not saying that 5 LU distance is set in stone. It's a recommendation or something to keep an eye on, maybe also as a quality check in your station. But it would be interesting to try with, say, Japanese, Chinese, other languages from a completely different, with a completely different background. I agree.
Have you done any studies on short-term sensitivity changes to hearing from loud to soft content? One of the challenges we have with commercial television is while the commercials might be normalized -24, the program leading up to that commercial break could be very soft due to the people standing over the dead body, and then the commercial comes on. So there's that dialogue ratio change. Have you done any studies on how the ear responds during short-term intervals?
Yeah, we did some studies maybe 10 years ago, and they were done 2 studies that I know of. Dolby have done a study on dialogue only, so how much you could tolerate the level of dialogue changing from one program to the next. And I was involved with the company I worked with at that time with a study doing the same, but for general content, so not just with speech, but also if you had 2 music programs. And the interesting thing is that we found the results were very similar. We are much more tolerant, or we are more tolerant of the level dropping than of the level going up. So if we're at the level we want to be, then you can roughly expect that 95% of your listeners will try to adjust the level if the average level jumps up by 5 or jumps down by 8. So that's sort of the asymmetry that's there. And I believe I remember our own numbers by heart, but I think, Craig, you're here. I think it was something in the same ballpark, at least from Dolby, when it came to speech. So that's sort of the playing field before people get too annoyed, if that answers your question.
So a couple of questions. Are there threats? I've heard in the past threats of Europeans wanting to regulate movie sound levels. So are any regulations in place, or what's going on there?
Yeah, a few countries have regulations now. Belgium, for instance, are among the strictest. But I'm convener of this working group under the European Union to prevent hearing loss, especially in kids. And we have just been mandated to go outside music listening. So we will now also cover gaming and recreational sound in general. There hasn't been yet any you could say we are not obliged yet to look into cinema, but I think it could happen at some point. I think if there are too many of the cases like this one here with Puss in Boots, I would expect it would happen within the next 5 or 10 years.
So in Belgium, you say there is a regulation, and does that cause the dialogue to be harder to be understood when they've turned it down to that level?
I haven't heard problems in Belgium about dialogue levels, so maybe it's okay. And maybe it's also a question of this is for adult movies. I don't know if there's anything in Belgium specifically for kids, but I haven't heard any problem in adult movies of speech intelligibility getting lost when levels are turned down.
Okay, so the loudness-dialogue ratio, I mean, it's not a constant. What I find is a lot of programs, the dynamic range of the dialogue element is way too large.
I agree.
And it'll drop 20 dB, and you just can't hear it anymore.
No, and that's a good point, because also when this dialogue anchor approach was developed, then there was like pretty, you could say, uniform rules or ways things were done in the film industry. And precisely as you say, the normal level or average spoken word would be at the same level in the beginning of the movie as at the end. But that's not the case anymore. The study by the EBU showed that precisely that you say that the loudness range of dialogue could be substantial. And then, of course, what is then the anchor? Is that average level? Is it normal speech? Is it average speech? Is it any speech, including whispering and shouting? And there, I think we should go by the BSA 1864 standard, which is the normal speech. I think that's the most reasonable. But again, how do you define that precisely? That's why the rubber band comes into play.
Has there been any thought about the actual transducer that's used in typical movie theaters? So, for instance, a simple horn that has characteristics that may be uncomfortable to the ear. And it's because of the specific characteristics of that transducer. So, you might perceive it as loud, and then you turn down everything else. Those elements are not a horn. So the ratio between the perceived loudness of the dialogue against all the rest of the elements may be affected.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, but I would expect that it's more the lack of uniform coverage than the horn as such that would be the sinner here, because horns, of course, are quite directive. But I agree with you, of course, that there could be some annoyance or disturbance factors from horns sort of beaming. But that's more maybe a technology issue than it's actually a level issue. Yeah.
Hi, Charlie Sharp from Prime Video. Massively appreciate all the work and research that you've put into this. Heeding the warning about, the danger that these issues will present if they're not managed. And I definitely feel a collective responsibility from all areas in the industry. We'll definitely reach out after. Do you see a world where consumer devices also play a role in perhaps warning messages if they're left on for too long in our binge watching, society, especially with younger people? Do you think they would also play a role and, perhaps monitor that on the back end? Or I don't know, where do you see the responsibility lying for television sets and such?
I think we, as an industry, we should be better at warning the kids. Of course, it should not be that they are thrown too many false warnings. So it's a question of doing it in a relevant way. But there are being developed methods of doing that. And for instance, Apple are building it into handshaking between their devices in good ways. And we hope with the Bluetooth 6 standard that more companies will do this. So depending on the headset you're using, they can communicate between the device and the headset, and you can always remain updated. So I think there's a definite responsibility of Bluetooth 6 to make that handshaking work. I don't think it's the responsibility of broadcasters as such. I think it's, besides from maybe if you drive too much difference between the loudness of the average program and the dialogue level, then that could be a factor in itself. But besides from that, I think the responsibility is downstream of you.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think I've got a hint that I should continue here. So I'll do that if you, but at the end of this, if there's more questions on sound exposure, please feel free, but I'll just...
Yeah, just to continue on that, obviously sound bars are an issue. And, they do their own processing, particularly with, dialogue level, quasi-virtual dialogue level and how they do that. So, maybe there's a way to have specs on that or something or another in the future so people understand really what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And there are, of course, rogue, you could say playback systems as well. What I didn't mention is that one of the biggest problems in WHO is actually Africa, where many, especially what you could say, males between 18 and 30 develop hearing loss because they are listening to completely insane, what I would call rogue speaker systems, and have come. So that's tragic, of course, that this is outside what we would call our normal sphere, where we could motivate people to follow different rules, but then the system again becomes the problem. I
guess that's more of as the EA, Consumer Electronics Association.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll carry on here, but if you think of more questions on sound exposure when I'm done here in 25 minutes, then feel free to go back to that topic again, because I would like to talk about auditory envelopment. So before it was more about safe listening. Now it's more about pleasure in listening.